Welcome to 502 Conversations. I'm Brian Kirby, and I'm very pleased today to have as my guest Massimo Pigliucci. Thank you very much for being here.
A pleasure.
And I have an extensive bio on you, which I will read because I want to get this information out there. Massimo Pigliucci has a doctorate in genetics from the University of Ferrara, a PhD in evolutionary biology from UConn, and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Tennessee. He is currently the K.D. Rainey Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York, correct?
That's
and
correct.
Do correct me if I get anything wrong because things change. Your research interests include the philosophy of the philosophy of biology, the relationship between science and philosophy, and the nature of pseudoscience. You've published in the New York Times, Philosophy Now, and the Philosopher's Magazine, among many others. You have 142 technical papers in science and philosophy, and you are the author or editor of 10 technical and public outreach books, including Nonsense on Stilts, How to Tell Science from Bunk, which is right here, Philosophy of Pseudoscience, Reconsidering the Demarcation Problem, and How to Be a Stoic, Ancient Wisdom for a Modern Life. And that's just 3 of the books. You are a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry and a contributing editor to the magazine Skeptical Inquirer. You previously edited the, I was going to say Scientia Salon, but it's Scientius?
Yeah, it's pretty close.
Okay,
pretty
Scientius Salon web magazine, which was devoted to getting your colleagues out of the ivory tower to engage with Main Street. And that's how you phrased it, correct?
Yeah.
And he has several free downloads available on such topics as philosophy, science, and skepticism. Is it still at platofootnote.wordpress.com?
Yeah, people can get there,
okay,
yeah.
Plato footnote, one word, .wordpress.com. And you're actually now on Patreon, right?
Correct.
All right. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely.
Because you cover, a lot of times I'll start these conversations with, I'm not the brightest bulb in the box, or in the room. Not the brightest bulb in the room. And never has that been more true than today. Well, you don't usually get a PhD in genetics, philosophy, and biology, and that's just
That's
great.
unusual, yeah, that's right.
And we're the same age, I think.
54, so.
I'm 52, so.
It's about there.
Your mother's probably more
Yeah,
proud.
it's an unusual dual career. And it's not unusual for scientists to become interested in philosophy, especially late in their career, later than my age usually. And some scientists do start writing philosophy, but to actually change career, shift wholesale from one field to the other and going through the process of going back to graduate school, that's actually fairly unusual. In fact, I don't know of any other example. I'm sure they're out there, but.
And I should have also mentioned you have hundreds of episodes of Rationally Speaking podcast. You used to co-host that. I'm not even caught up on those yet. I haven't got to 132. Is that where you dropped?
132, yeah, that's right.
And actually, part of the reason you're here is because of those podcasts. Or part of the reason I asked you here is not only because of your books, but because of the podcast. So this will be a conversation, sort of science, sort of philosophy, because you've done so much. I have questions about each of things what you do. Of several different questions about each area that you are involved with. And it's a conversation, so you may drop a word that I have to interrupt and explain, or a concept that I don't get. So don't, just bear with me. All right, let me start with a question, and it's a long question. So let me get a little bit out there, and then I'll give you the floor. So I asked this question of James Alcock last year. What is knowledge, and is there a difference between belief and knowledge? And he told me belief has 2 parts, the content and the degree of conviction. That was a short version of his answer.
Right.
So how do I know if I'm acquiring knowledge or not? And for it to be knowledge, it has to be true, I assume. So I've met priests that have PhDs in theology, yet they also learned how to turn bread into flesh.
Right.
So theology, philosophy of theology, there's knowledge there, right? Is turning bread into flesh, is that knowledge? So,
yeah, that's a great question. I actually think that nobody's done better than Plato in defining knowledge. And plenty of people have tried, and this comes with a caveat because there are some contemporary philosophers who have proposed a few slight improvements on the basic definition. But setting those aside, which are kind of technical details, the basic definition of knowledge in the Western philosophical tradition has always been the one that's been given by Plato. And it is that knowledge is justified through belief. So there's 3 components. Let's take each one of them one at a time. First of all, for you to claim that you know something, it also means that you believe it. it would be really awkward to claim that you know something that you actually don't believe, right? So you wouldn't say, I know the Earth is flat, if you don't believe that the Earth is flat. It would be kind of a sort of internal logical contradiction, let's say. So belief comes embedded into the definition of knowledge. If you don't believe it, then you don't know it, for sure. Now, the other two components are justified and true, and those are both problematic. Let's start with the justified part first. If you cannot justify, so if you say, I know that I can turn bread into flesh.
And I'm assuming they believe it.
Yes, I'm sure that most of them at least believe it.
Okay.
So the belief part is fine. Now, the next question is, okay, what's the justification for that belief? What are your reasoning, your reasons, your evidence for believing? And that's where the first problems start, because now the theologian is going to give me all sorts of theology-based reasons, really no empirical evidence, because by definition he can't give me empirical evidence actually of that particular phenomenon. Transubstantiation is something that you cannot put under a microscope. So empirical evidence is out. No.
You cannot? So if I put it on a table for a week, it won't rot?
No, that's right. It won't rot.
Well, then is it flesh?
Well, that's the miracle, right?
We all know what blood tastes like because we've all had a bloody lip.
Correct.
We all know what wine tastes like.
Correct.
The wine doesn't really taste any different to me.
And that's why I don't believe that, that particular notion, because if in the justification, which ultimately comes down to, well, it's a miracle, it's a mystery, okay, that's no justification. So you're just telling me that you believe something with no justification, therefore, no, I don't think you have knowledge of that. Now, the third component, it's really tricky, however, because it's the true part, right? Well, how do you know that something is true or not? Now, let's take a more mundane example. So let's say that I believe that the Earth rotates around the sun. Fine, I certainly believe that. You can ask me for a justification of it, and I can give you a approximate description of the astronomy involved. I can tell you about planetary orbits, and you can even ask me how do you know this? And I can say, well, certain kinds of observations, certain, you can measure the eclipses and the shade of the moon and all that sort of stuff. Fine. But is it true? Well, not really, because it turns out that it was true up until we believed in Newtonian mechanics. We accepted Newtonian mechanics. The sun was actually a fixed point and the Earth was rotating around it. But with Einstein, we have a slightly more sophisticated view of things, such as that the Earth and the sun both rotate around a common center of gravity. It's just that because the sun is much more massive than the Earth, that center of gravity, for all effective purposes, falls within the sun itself, but not at the center. So is it the case that, is it knowledge when I say that the Earth goes around the sun? Well, it's kind of approximate knowledge because it's an approximate truth, right? So you have to have all of these three components. You have to believe it. That's the easy part. People believe all sorts of stuff, whether it's true or not, right? You have to be able to justify it. And if we enforced that clause in the Platonic definition of knowledge, it would turn out that we all know very few things, comparatively speaking. Because, for instance, I'm sure you believe, like me, in quantum mechanics, but
I believe in it.
Right,
I can't justify it, and I can't. And I have had a theoretical physicist sit in that chair. And
right. Yeah. So if I were to actually justify that belief, then I ask my friend, the physicist, because I have no idea.
And there is an appropriate time to rely on authority.
Absolutely.
It's not an argument from authority if you actually are referring to an authority.
No, but that means that I don't know it. I should say that I believe the quantum mechanical theory is true, not that I know it, because if somebody asked me for a justification, then I wouldn't be able to provide it. Also, it turns out that quantum mechanical theory is not exactly true. Physicists themselves know that there is something wrong going on. That's why they're looking for the next, more fundamental theory. So technically, it's not really true. It's kind of close to the truth. So it gets complicated. It gets iffy.
All right, so here's devil's advocate. You believe in quantum mechanics. You have a friend. I'm sure you have several theoretical physicist friends.
And some their enemy.
I only have one. But all right, so let me spin it around. I'm a Catholic. The transubstantiation exists. I believe it, but I can't justify it. I rely on my priest as the authority.
Correct.
I've just made the same step you did.
That's right. That's right. And that's an important point, and you're absolutely right. That is why...
Well, what are you going to say to me?
Well, I'm going to say to you, Let me back up for a second. So I'll tell you in a minute what I think a reasonable response is. But I want to take the full force of your objection because it's a good one.
And I didn't mean to be rude when I said, "What are you saying to me?" I was talking like we're two friends bantering over a beer. I'm sorry if it came off that way.
No, that's all right. But it's a really important objection, and it's actually an objection that I think people in the skeptic community don't take seriously enough, because they don't seem to realize that, in fact, a lot of what we believe is a question of authority. Right? So a lot of people in the skeptic community are throw around logical fallacies at people and say, "Oh, that's an argument from authority," and that's done also on the side of pseudoscience. A lot of creationists would say, if I quote an evolutionary biologist, they'll say, "Oh, that's an argument from authority." Yes, but arguments from authority sometimes are good arguments, because if I'm ignorant about a particular area of expertise, of course I'm going to quote an authority. What else am I going to do? If I have a toothache, I'm going to go to a dentist. Why am I going to go to a dentist and not to my car mechanic? Because it's the dentist that is the expert on teeth. I don't know enough about it, and the car mechanic doesn't know enough about it, right? So am I making an argument from authority? Now, here's where it gets interesting. The difference between the theologian and the quantum physicist, I think, is, I don't want to oversimplify it, but it's about the difference between going to fix your car at a car mechanic and going to a psychic who will tell you what's wrong with your car.
You've made a big statement.
Yes, I have made a big statement. And here's the difference. The car mechanic will get it wrong some of the time, but most of the times he'll get it right. He will fix your car. The psychic will get it right exactly a random number of times. There will be no rhyme or reasons for the car mechanic. So I think of the difference between a theologian and a quantum physicist in the same way. I don't see any products of theology that actually work, other than, of course, people's faith, but that's kind of begging the question. On the other hand, there are a lot of products of physics that do work. There's many of them in this room, right? So it is the point that I'm granting to you is important, which is it does come down, for most of us, most of the times, it does come down to trust. And so then the next question is, who are you going to trust? And philosophers have thought about this for a long time, and there is a standard literature on this thing. And it turns out that, how do I decide who to trust? Well, kind of commonsensical. Let me go back to the example of the dentist or the car mechanic. Why is it that you bring the car to the car mechanic? Well, first of all, because you have a general idea the car mechanics fix cars. Fine. But why that particular car mechanic? Well, if you think about it, the first thing that happens is you walk into the shop, and usually they will have some kind of certificate that says, approved by the state of such and such, or Better Business Bureau, or something like that. In other words, there is some kind of certification that this person really is who he claims to be. But that's, of course, not enough, because anybody can have a certificate hang on his wall. You have to know where the certificate is from. Is it really the BBB? Well, if it is, then that's a certain guarantee. Why is it a certain guarantee? Because I trust the BBB. Then the next question is, well, does this mechanic actually know what he's doing? Did he fix your car? Did you look at reviews of other people whose cars he has fixed or failed to fix, and so on and so forth? And of course, you will keep going to the mechanic only up to the point in which he starts failing regularly and not fixing your car, at which point you look for another mechanic. It's the same exact thing in every other aspect of life, including highly selective expertise such as theology, philosophy, science. It does come down to trust. And so people need to know what are the signs of somebody you can or cannot trust, should or should not trust, both in terms of individuals and, more importantly, in terms of institutions.
All right. I want to stay on this knowledge thing, if you don't mind. I'm a musician. Do you have any musical training, by the way?
If you count self-taught guitar and alto sax, yeah, but that's about it. I can read music. Oh,
okay. So, you've heard the major scale. Mm-hmm. You know what it's called. But did you know every scale also has modes? So there's Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian. Okay, they go up, depending on what note you start on. You could read all about the Dorian mode. You could write a dissertation on it. People have, I'm sure.
Right.
And you could understand the whole step, half step. You could look at dozens of songs, in Dorian and have complete knowledge and get a PhD in musicology with a dissertation in Dorian. Let me play one musical example for you. And this
Absolutely.
so you could do all this, right? You could do all that work without ever having heard it.
Right.
You could become an expert with it. So my question, this is just, so, you know, Gilligan's Island, the theme is a Dorian tune. It's because one of the main characteristics of Dorian is a 1 minor to flat 7 major. So it'd be like, so do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Right, that's Dorian. Also some folky things like, you've heard like that train beat. Do-do-do, that's, so you got 1 minor, flat 7 major, and then 5 minor, completely different from major. Okay. Then you got Miles Davis comes along. You like jazz at all?
Oh yes.
Okay, so now we have a new. Those are all triads, right? And then we've got this tune he wrote called "So What." Right? That's a Dorian melody, and they voiced it like this instead. McCoy Tyner with these. All right. Totally different sound, still Dorian.
Right.
Now I know that's a long example. Here's my question. If you got your PhD in Dorian, I'll just say Dorian, but musicology, and you'd written about Dorian, and you wrote about Miles Davis tunes, and you wrote about Gilligan's Island, these are all examples of Dorian, but you'd never listened to Miles Davis solo, which people have actually written their dissertations on certain solos and made arrangements of them. If you've never played it or heard it, do you know what Dorian is?
Right. That's a great question. And turns out there is
so not a failed example.
No, I think there is a good answer for that one. So philosophers that specialize in theory of knowledge, there's an entire branch of philosophy called epistemology, which is about the theory of knowledge. Precisely because of examples like these. A standard example is the difference between the theoretical knowledge of how to swim and actually jumping into a pool and study swimming.
Oh, okay.
Right, that sort of stuff.
That.
Now, because of those examples, the philosophers draw a distinction between knowledge, what they call knowledge of, and knowledge that.
Knowledge
that. So knowledge of is the theoretical knowledge that Plato was concerned with. So the definition of knowledge as justified true belief applies to knowledge of, so to theoretical knowledge, to things like, you know, do you know about quantum mechanics? Do you know about the sun and the earth and things like that? Or in your case, do you know about Dorian and so on?
That's just an example.
Right. But then there is knowledge that. The knowledge that is, by definition, embodied knowledge, meaning that you actually have to do the damn thing. You have because your body learned. It's not just your mind. It's not just something you can explain to people in words. It actually requires certain actions. It requires certain muscle memory. It requires certain rhythms. It requires certain coordination and so on and so forth. That's knowledge that. And there the definition of knowledge is in fact far more vague, for one thing.
It's vague.
Yes, it's far more vague because it involves the whole body. And all the senses. It's not just a conceptual thing. It's not just a theoretical thing. So yes, you picked up on something very important, and there is a known, it matches with a very well-known distinction in philosophy, in epistemology, between these two kinds of knowledge. And one of the ideas is that, as you hinted very clearly, you cannot actually reduce one kind of knowledge to the other. You can learn all that there is to know theoretically about a certain subject, but that's not the same as actually being able to play an instrument or hear the difference between the different versions of the same tune and so on and so forth. That one you have to do it. There's no shortcut. There's no theoretical shortcut that you can take.
Well, I have to thank you for that, actually, because it came directly from one of your podcasts where you threw out something. You didn't throw it out, but it seemed like an offhand remark where you said, well, you can't just say you read it in a book someplace. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, I read so much in books that I learn. I learn so much from books. And over the course of a week, as I thought about the podcast and I've learned so much in books, I realized, well, I have read a lot in books, but then I kind of didn't know it until I experienced it.
Yeah, exactly.
And in a backwards example, I learned how to sail. Are you familiar with sailing?
Not much.
Great. It's better if you don't know, actually, I think. I learned how to sail one summer just by getting in a boat and watching people and go around, and I kept the sheet in all the time. I thought that was the best way to do it. You always have the sail. And I didn't, it was fun, but it was a little dangerous because I didn't know what I was doing. And that winter I bought a book on sailing, And I read, oh, you don't always keep it a certain way. You let it do this and you let it do that, and it's much faster and much better. So it was the opposite experience of needing the book to, learning from the book after the fact.
After the fact, absolutely. Well, I can give you a personal example. So when I was younger, I spent a significant number of years trying different martial arts, and my favorite one was judo. And judo is a very beautiful, I think very physical and very elegant kind of martial art. And I learned it from experience, of course. You go to a gym and there is a master who instructs you in things, and it doesn't give you a theoretical speech on things. It just, you know, shows you the moves and then throws you down on the mat, and then you learn little by little. And I got good enough to get 3 or 4 belts. But then I also started reading about it. And the theoretical knowledge did enrich my practice, because the theoretical knowledge showed me very clearly that all of the basic moves in judo that I read were really applications of basic physics, in particular leverage, right? So you have all sorts of different kinds of leverage. And once you understand that, you say, oh, that's why it works so efficiently. That's why there are certain particular ways of doing moves rather than others, and so on and so forth. But if I had started with the book and learned all the theoretical physics about judo and then got on a tatami against an opponent, I would have been floored immediately. It's just like no question. I'm very confused. That's right.
I have a PhD in this.
That's right, exactly. That's why.
You can't beat me,
you're
man.
Still on the floor.
Okay, so one more quick question on, always quick question on.
There's no such thing as a quick question, right?
Well, I guess we're getting to that. Well, let me. I have 2 questions here, and you can answer them both. Let me ask them both. Okay, you get the knowledge from the book, and then you have to do the experience. But there's so much knowledge already out there that someone else has done in the science. It's like physics and biology. I'm not going to build my own telescope. I'm not going to build my own. I have to rely on the authority of others. I can't carry out every experiment to get where I need to be. I just don't have that much time if I want to come up with a new PhD in chemistry, for example. They teach you how to do the method, but you don't have to do all the experiments, I'm assuming. So that's one question. And then back to how do we know things. So how do we, you touched on this with authority, but if we're working through it personally, I just said, so how do we know things deductively, intuitively, from authority, revelatory? What's the hierarchy there?
Oh, that's a good question.
So I guess there are 2 very separate questions.
2 separate questions. Let's start with the first one. The first question, the idea that nobody can redo all the experiments or relearn even all the theory, for instance, is the reason why we have this inevitable trade-off in modern science. It becomes more and more specialized. It requires more and more people to know less and less stuff because they have to focus on whatever. So if you're a career scientist these days and you wanted to make a new contribution to human knowledge, well, good luck with that, because there's been generations and generations of people before you who have done a lot of work. And now the advantage of that is that you can build on that work and move further than any one of them would have. But the disadvantage is now you have to know a lot of stuff before you can actually figure out where to make the contribution. And so the result of that is that people tend to specialize very early. So we refer to people as biologists, for instance, or physicists, but there's no such thing as a biologist or a physicist, generally speaking. My first career was in evolutionary biology, which is a very specific subfield within biology. I trained as a general biologist, but I couldn't do research in molecular biology, in biochemistry, in ecology even, which is a pretty close related field, in a bunch of other things. I had to pick a particular specialty. And even within that specialty, I immediately zeroed in on a very, very specific sub-discipline within evolutionary biology, so that, yeah, broadly speaking, if you ask me a question about evolutionary biology in general, I can answer. But if the question becomes too specific and too technical, I'll have to call a colleague who actually specializes in that area. And then he or she will be able to answer that question. So there is an inevitable tendency to specialize. And this is not just in the sciences, it's across the fields. It happens the same in philosophy. It happens the same, to be the same in history or and so on and so forth. So there is no way out of this. Unfortunately, the human capacity, the human lifespan is what it is, and the human brain is what it is, and nobody can be, there will never be ever again a Renaissance man or woman. Leonardo da Vinci was the last one, pretty much, because at the time it was possible to really go from amazingly different fields and be actually a master in all of them. Today, it's not even close. So there it is. That's the situation. There's no escaping from it. So what we're going to look at is the more time passes, the more you're going to have a very highly specialized number of scientists working on very tiny notions. Now, partially to counter that, I think that's one reason science needs philosophy. Because one of the goals in philosophy of science, which is it's a subset of philosophy, of course, is to kind of keep an eye on the big picture of what scientists are doing. And the reason philosophers can afford to do that is because they don't have to do the experiments, right? So scientists have to write grant proposals and do the experiments, write the papers and all that sort of stuff. And so that's all the time he has, and it has to be very specific. A philosopher has mostly the time to actually go to the library and read what a bunch of different scientists from a bunch of different fields are working on and try to connect the dots across the fields. So I think that's a major reason actually why science does need philosophy, because the philosophers are the ones that can afford the luxury these days to sort of step outside and look at at least slightly broader horizon of what science is doing.
But then are they gaining the knowledge without the experience? So they're relying on the writing, but they're not going to do all the experiments, but then they can come back with new questions, I suppose.
Correct. That's right.
But they don't, so we kind of come full circle as to the knowledge without the experience. And
yeah, there is no experience, no direct experience, but we're talking about largely knowledge of the first category of knowledge, so theoretical knowledge, right? So if you're talking about physics or biology, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, of course, there is also a degree of trust that is involved into this, right? So the philosopher has to trust that the scientist is doing the right thing and is doing correctly the experiments and all that. But there is a level of check for that, right? Scientists publish in science journals where there are peer colleagues who actually check, to some extent at least, to the accuracy of what they're doing. So there is layers and layers and layers. Yeah, it really gets fascinatingly complex.
So technically, it might sound like the philosopher is kind of a little bit smarter than the scientist because they have to understand it and explain it back to other scientists, maybe.
To some extent, yeah. I wouldn't say smarter, but again, broader.
Word. Broader, okay.
Yes, broader,
and so
yes.
It seems like there's I don't know if this is true, but it seems like in some of what I've heard past several years while I've been gaining knowledge is that sounds like a one-way street, that philosophers rely on scientists, and then scientists can sometimes poo-poo the philosophy end of it.
Yeah, it's not entirely a one-way street because there are good examples of philosophers actually helping the discussion in science. But these are very specific examples. Let me give you one area which is where it's happening right now because that will give you an idea. So typically, it's the role of philosophy of science to study science from the outside. So philosophers of science are interested in the big picture, as I said, in how science works, what's the big tapestry that is coming out of science. And in that sense, philosophy of science is broader than the science that it's studying. So in that sense, in that respect, it is a one-way street. The philosophers use the material that the scientists produce for their own purposes. Where the feedback comes in occasionally is when the science itself gets to a point where the empirical evidence is not available or it's way underwhelming and it doesn't settle disputes. Because then the scientists themselves run to the borderlines between science and philosophy. Their discussions become very theoretical, very abstract, and I would say philosophical.
Do they realize it?
Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So I'll give you an example when they do. So a major controversy in fundamental physics that's been going on now for a good number of years is about string theory. String theory is the dominant theoretical framework for the next fundamental theory, the one that is hopefully going to unify quantum mechanics and general relativity, which are the currently dominant theories in fundamental physics. The problem is, we know that quantum mechanics and general relativity are incomplete because when you apply them to the same kind of problems, like the physics of black holes, for instance, they give you different results. If they give you different results, that means that either one of them is wrong, possibly both. They are incomplete. so physicists themselves think that there is some kind of more fundamental theory that they're trying to figure out. Now, there are several candidates out there, but by far the most popular is called string theory. We don't need to get into what string theory is. The thing is, string theory has been around since the 80s, and even though theoretically it's very beautiful, it's very interesting mathematically, et cetera, it hasn't made a single empirical discovery yet. Now we're talking 30, close to 40 years later. So people are getting nervous because there's all this money being spent in theoretical physics, all these PhDs that have been trained in string theory, all these faculty positions and so on and so forth, and then they produce essentially nothing. They produce mathematics, very, very good mathematics, but not really physics. So they're starting, some of their own colleagues starting accusing them of not being really doing science. And that's of course a philosophical discussion. Who is doing science, who is not doing science, by what criteria? So it turns out that a few years ago I was invited at a conference at, on string theory in Munich, in Germany.
As an arbiter? To solve this problem? Well, you're standing in the middle?
Yeah, so the first reaction was like, I wrote back to the organizer and said, you got the wrong guy, because I'm not a physicist and I'm not even a philosopher of physics. My specialty is philosophy of biology, not physics. So I think you got the wrong guy, and if we want, I can refer you to some colleagues. And the organizer said, no, you got the right guy. Here's what we want. Turns out that the physicists on both sides have been throwing at each other accusations of doing bad philosophy, and in particular of misapplying the theories of a well-known 20th century philosopher known as, whose name is Karl Popper.
Okay.
Karl Popper wrote about how science works and about what qualifies as a scientific theory and what doesn't qualify as a scientific theory. And they were basically accusing each other of misusing Popper and not understanding Popper and all that sort of stuff. So the organizer said, look, what we need is, right at the beginning of the conference, a neutral observer, somebody who has nothing to really say about string theory. So that's why they didn't want a physicist or even a philosopher of physics. Somebody who has no opinion about the theory at all, but who is going to come in and give us a little bit introductory talk about what Popper actually did say and didn't say, because I'm sure the organizers said most of these people have actually not read Popper. They know
that one line everyone knows.
They went on Wikipedia and checked it out.
The
but they didn't
falsifiability
really,
clause.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's all they know.
That's right. All they know is the falsifiability.
And that's a bit
stuff.
outdated, I've heard.
It is definitely outdated. And so this was, to me, this was an interesting example of where the philosophers can help. When the discussion in science gets to the point of really abstract theoretical concepts that even get into the nature itself of what science is, or what a scientific theory should look like, that's where the philosophers can come in and say, you know, we actually thought about this for a while, and we can help you out. And it was a very congenial conference. I mean, the physicists were very happy about that. So,
all right, that's great, actually. Good. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Let's bounce back to my levels of knowledge: deductive, inductive, revelatory. What's the hierarchy there?
Okay, I would say revelatory knowledge is no such a thing. It's an oxymoron.
Oh, okay.
As far as I'm concerned. Of course, the theologian would disagree.
Well, what about, you know, we'll go back to the priest. I don't know it changes into flesh. I trust my priest because he says it does. And, you know, when he hands it to me and he puts it on my tongue, I just have this warm feeling go through me.
Yeah. And
I'm experiencing.
Right, and we have pretty good psychological explanations for why people feel that way.
Well, you have a psychological explanation, but I'm telling you it's the Spirit of Christ filling me.
And you can believe it. I just don't feel, I don't question the belief.
All right.
Remember that this the distinction between, so belief is one of the three components of knowledge. I am not questioning the belief. People believe all sorts of things, and they think they have good reasons for it. And I'm not here to question people's beliefs. But if you say that that counts as knowledge, well, knowledge has to be shareable. One of the things about knowledge is it has to be shareable, especially theoretical knowledge, knowledge of, as I was talking about. So if you know something, you ought to be able to explain it to me. And even knowledge that, if you know how to play an instrument, I ought to be able somehow to learn how to play that instrument. It's not magic.
No.
Right? And therefore, if it's not transferable, if it's not something that it can be intersubjective, as they say, then it's not knowledge. It's your opinion, it's your belief, call it whatever you want, and it's respectable because it's a belief, and everybody is entitled to their beliefs. But I don't count that as knowledge. So in my mind, Relative authority knowledge is no such a thing. It's an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms.
All right, let's
now,
go back to deductibility and not the IRS.
Yeah, we don't want to do the IRS. Deduction, induction, and you mentioned something
intuition.
else.
I don't know if you consider the same as revelatory or not. But
no,
because, okay.
I don't.
All right, great.
So let's talk about all three of them. Let's leave intuition for last because it's actually a little bit more complicated. So deduction and induction are the two major categories of logical inference that are recognized in epistemology.
But people use them informally all the time.
Yes, that's right. Now, broadly speaking, and there is a lot more complications than what I'm about to say, but broadly speaking, deduction is what mathematicians and logicians do. Right? So you start from certain premises or certain axioms in mathematics, and then you logically derive certain conclusions. So if I can say, you know, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Well, that's a simple case of syllogism, is a type of deductive logic. If it's based on two assumptions, that all men are in fact mortal and that Socrates is a man. If those two assumptions are correct, then it turns out that the knowledge, the conclusion that Socrates is mortal is certain. There's no question about it. Okay? That's the beauty about deductive knowledge. If the axioms or the assumptions are correct and the structure of the argument is correct or the structure of the mathematical proof is correct, then there is no arguing against it. You will not argue against the Pythagorean theorem. You're going to lose. It's there and it's done. Of course, you can argue with the premises. You can say, well, but I know of an immortal man, in which case the whole thing crumbles. Or you can say, well, but Socrates was not a man, was a dog, in which case the whole thing crumbles again. So if you can successfully argue against one of the premises, or if you can show that the way the premises are connected in order to get to the conclusion is invalid, it's incorrect, then you have a counter-argument.
Let me ask a brief question here. So have there been arguments that have been settled for centuries and then someone comes in and turns a premise around and it's gone?
That I know of, not.
No kidding.
None in logic or in mathematics.
Okay, go on.
So, wow. Which is really astounding. It's really astounding. People have found occasionally mistakes in proofs, like for instance, Euclidean, some of Euclid's theorems turned out to be correct, but the specific proofs proposed by Euclid had some mistakes in it.
Okay, I didn't mean to go off.
No, that's all right. But it's a great question. So in logic and mathematics, once you prove something, that's done. You're good for it. Now, inductive logic, on the other hand, is what inductive logic is what scientists use most of the times, and it's what everyday people like us use all the time. So if let's say, you know, when I go to campus from my apartment in Manhattan, I live on the Upper East Side, so I get out of my house and my apartment, and I get down and get the M86 bus and then the #1 subway. Well, every day, I'm using inductive logic. I say, well, yesterday the 86 bus was passing on this particular street. I'm assuming that today it's going to be the same. Yesterday and for many days before, the #1 train was going from this street to that street, and I'm assuming that it's going to be the same. Of course, sometimes that assumption is incorrect, because maybe there was a diversion of the bus route due to work on the street, and so maybe the bus is going to skip my stop. And that's the nature of induction. Induction is about generalizing from a sample of observations to a broader category of observation. The problem with that is it's very powerful because it increases your knowledge. You can apply induction to all sorts of new phenomena. You can predict all sorts of new stuff. The trade-off is, however, you don't have certainty. It's always a probabilistic argument. It's like likely the bus will be there, but I can't be certain. In deductive logic, I can be absolutely certain of the conclusions, but at the same time, I also haven't learned anything new, because the conclusion that Socrates is a man was already embedded in the two assumptions from which I started. And that's true in mathematics as well. The conclusion of the Pythagorean theorem was embedded in the assumptions of the Pythagorean theorem.
So what I hear you say, if I'm correct here, largely life is inductive. Even though we may think we're doing deductive things, we're largely living an inductive life.
Correct.
And anything can happen.
We use mostly induction as a reasoning. Now, there is actually a third type of reasoning, which rarely comes up in conversation, but it's actually the most powerful one, especially in science. It's often confused, it's often categorized under a kind of induction, but it isn't. Philosophers actually consider a different category. It's got a weird name. It's called abduction.
I have heard that.
Yeah, and it's got nothing to do with...
I've never gotten a definition that I could
right,
get my
and
hands
it's got
around,
nothing to do with aliens, you know, picking you up in the middle of the night and doing anal probing or anything like that. What it is the original name was, this concept was introduced by William Will, who was a philosopher in the early 19th century. He was actually one of Darwin's mentors. And he's, by the way, the guy that invented the word scientist, which did not exist until 1834. He's the one that put it on the map. You have figured out that in many cases, we don't just generalize from a certain number of observations to a broader category, which is what I just did earlier with my example of the bus, right? That's actually, in effect, induction. What we do is something a little more complicated, a little more sophisticated. We get information about a particular problem or to be solved from a number of different sources, and then we kind of sort of triangulate, as the way you put it is, we triangulate in logical space, and we try to get to the most likely explanation that accounts for all the information that is available. And that going for the most likely explanation, it's called abduction. It's an inference to the best explanation.
It sounds like inference to the best explanation.
It's the same thing.
Oh, it is the same.
It's the same thing.
Oh, now it makes more sense.
Inference to the best explanation is what philosophers call abduction. And it is the real thing, by the way. This is one of my pet peeves, so indulge me for a second. I'm a big Sherlock Holmes fan. And Sherlock Holmes often is characterized, even by Conan Doyle, as doing deduction. Sherlock Holmes did not do deduction. He did abduction.
Inference to the best explanation.
Inference to the best explanation, which is why Holmes sometimes can go wrong.
And wait, what year were the Holmes books written?
Late 19th century, early 20th century.
So, okay, so abduction was new.
It was there. Yeah,
we can forgive him for that.
That's right, we can forgive him. But that's why one of the refreshing things about Holmes' stories is that sometimes he doesn't get it right. Sometimes he's wrong, sometimes he doesn't get the solution. And that's because it all depends on the quality of the information you have. If the quality of information you have is very good, if you have a lot of clues pointing all in the same direction, then your confidence that you're getting the reasonable inference, the best explanation, it's very high. But if the clues are scarce or they're pointing in the different directions, then you kind of say, well, it may be the butler, but I don't have enough evidence to actually, pinpoint what happened.
And if I may just briefly, inference to the best explanation gets thrown around quite a bit inappropriately. I almost think, because I hear theologians use it quite a bit, the universe exists, the universe has to have a cause, therefore God exists. There are a lot of unstated premises, but sometimes people boil it down to that.
Yeah,
and that inference to the best explanation because it had to have an outside cause. You know the argument, I'm sure. But that seems to me not the inference from...
No, it's an abuse of the term, I think.
Abuse of the term.
That's right. And of course, that happens all the time. I mean, you invent a good concept, and then some people will inevitably abuse it. But of course, part of the trick here is what counts as a best explanation. And it is an interesting question because it's interesting you brought up the theologians. Because what counts as a best explanation depends on the background framework that we are adopting and we're sharing. Every explanation is always couched within a large background of unquestioned assumptions. So, for instance, if I do an experiment today in physics and I'm using a telescope, right? Therefore, it wouldn't be an experiment. It would be a set of observations. And let's say I'm claiming that I've discovered a new kind of galaxy by using this really large new telescope. Well, that's going to be convincing if you take on board a lot of stuff that I haven't actually questioned directly, like, for instance, the laws of optics. I didn't go back all the way and check on optics, or I didn't check on how the telescope was built. I didn't check on a bunch of other things. I take all of that background for granted, and then given that, I'm saying, if this is all true, then yes, here's a new type of galaxy. Let me give you an example that goes back to theology, ties back to theology. So modern skeptics and modern scientists are fond of making fun of the Jesuits back in the 1600s for having doubted Galileo, right? It's like, oh, they saw it. They saw the moons of Jupiter with their own eyes because Galileo gave a demonstration. He had a telescope and gave a demonstration. The Jesuit looked, and still didn't believe that Galileo was right. How stupid were those people? They were not stupid at all. it was a very reasonable kind of skepticism because the telescope did not exist until 20 years earlier. And it was invented by somebody in the Netherlands, and then Galileo himself improved it. So Galileo was trying to sell an entirely new notion, a revolutionary way of looking at the entire universe on the basis of an instrument that he himself had put together and it had never been tested by anybody else. Now, would you believe that kind of stuff? I would start to be suspicious that the guy is trying to sell me some snake oil.
Yeah.
Right? So the skepticism of the theologians, of the Jesuits, was not at all ill-founded. It was very reasonable. Now, of course, the more time passes, the more other astronomers build their own telescopes, they check the properties on known objects and so on and so forth. The more it turns out that the instrument is reliable, then the skepticism has to start fading away. And if it doesn't, then it's a question of ideological stubbornnness.
Okay, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
But the initial response was actually very reasonable. Yeah, I would have been skeptical of Galileo. I probably would have been interested in what he had to say because he had a good reputation as a professor of physics. But still, I would have been doubtful.
Well, it's a fantastic story to tell. Oh, I built this thing and I can see what?
A whole new thing, right?
Yeah, right.
Imagine somebody, the analogy today would be with somebody, so one of the other highly controversial things in modern physics is whether we live in a single universe or in a multiverse, in an infinite number of universes, right? Some physicists dismiss the notion as pure metaphysical speculation. Other physicists say, oh, this is very likely the case. Okay, I don't know whether it's the case or not. Now, suppose there were somebody tomorrow starts out and says, here, I built a new instrument. I can show you the multiverse.
I would like to see that.
I would like to see that, but I will first ask the question, okay, how do you know that this instrument is working here?
Yeah, yeah.
On what principles does this instrument actually use?
Or is this like
it
the
reliable?
fun house at the carnival?
Yeah, or is it just making up stuff as we go, right? Yeah.
Okay, so that covers revelatory, deduction, induction, and now abduction, inference about intuition. You said this was a bit more complicated?
Yeah, intuition is a little bit more complicated. So it turns out that there is some...
It's real, right?
It is real, but in a more limited fashion than most people seem to believe. So there is research, there's really good research in psychology on intuition. And basically intuition fundamentally is the output, the unconscious output of processing of the brain of a certain kind of large kinds of information. So for instance, if you drive a car, right, the way you start driving a car is initially very conscious. You have to pay attention to everything you do, right? Especially if it's a
and you're holding
stick
on.
shift. Yeah, and especially if it's a stick shift, you have to know the difference between paying attention consciously to the difference between the different pedals, etc. But the more you do that, the more this knowledge becomes sort of second nature. It becomes unconscious, subconscious, right? So much so that then you can start developing, the more you drive, you develop more good intuitions about driving. So that you will react to, let's say, somebody cutting you off on the highway far more quickly and far more instinctively without thinking about it. You don't stop and say, oh, somebody is cutting me off. Because if you do that, you're probably going to be in an accident. But with a lot of experience, having been in this kind of quick changing, fast changing situations, your brain has kind of processed all that information. You developed good intuitions as a driver. And if you're a professional driver, let's say a Formula One driver, for instance, then your intuitions are to the maximum in that particular domain. So you're highly intuitive in that sense. It's the result it's when an intuition is the answer that your brain gives to a question that it has processed over and over and over, especially from experience. That means that there's no such thing as a generally intuitive person. So, when people say, oh, I'm an intuitive person. Well, intuitive about what?
Yes, you're using intuition in a very specific...
Right. Intuitive about what? Intuition is domain specific. There's no such thing as a generic intuitive person. So if people may be intuitive about other people, if you are somebody, let's say in the entertainment industry or a journalist or something like that, who spends or a psychologist who spends a lot of time with people, then you might in fact become rightly intuitive about people's reactions and feelings and thoughts, because that's what you do. The best studies of intuitions are on chess playing. So it turns out that chess playing, it's easy to study, of course, because you can measure how well people know chess and so on and so forth. It turns out if you are a amateur, if you're a beginning chess player, you have to actually think very carefully through every move, and you usually don't think more than a couple of steps ahead because it's just you can't keep in mind all this stuff. If you graduate to the level of a professional player, it's much easier, and you will look at a chess problem on the board, and immediately you figure out what the right answer is. And if you're a master level chess player, then you will in fact very often solve a problem instantly, and then people will ask you, so why did you make that move? You have to think about it. In order to come up with an explanation, you had to think about it because you didn't solve the problem by thinking consciously about it. Your intuitions told you that you should make that move. And then you work out the logic after the fact. And you say, okay, well, I must have made that move because this was the situation and here's where my options, and that's where I went.
You scare me a little bit because I see what you're saying here. But it also seems like people could take this out of the domain and professionals could start relying on their intuition. Say, oh, I've been a cop for 20 years, so I know this. There's something here, or the TSA, or so. What you're saying here could be used in another way, or is that not?
No, that's right. There is a danger of overdoing it. There is a danger of relying on intuition. That's right.
In a different sense, I guess.
Correct. And again, in the philosophy of science, there is an interesting distinction, which was actually introduced by Karl Popper, whom we mentioned earlier, between the context of discovery and the context of justification. What he said was that scientists often have work, in fact, good scientists always work out of intuition. The first time, as a practicing scientist, I know what he was talking about. The first time you have an idea and you put together something, it's intuitive. You don't actually sit down and write a proposal about a very specific thing. It's like, I got a sense that this thing is going on. This particular organism is going to react in this particular way. Let me figure it out. The initial idea comes out of your intuitions. Why? Well, because you have background experience. You've trained as an undergraduate, as a graduate student, as a postdoc, and then as a faculty. So you got years and years and years of experience with a particular material and with particular problems. So your intuitions are probably good, but probably good doesn't mean that they're knowledge, right? That doesn't mean that they are established facts. So the first phase of discovery, according to Popper, is the context of discovery. That's intuition, and there is really no logical justification for it. We have plenty of examples of anecdotal examples, but there's plenty of them, of scientists walking into a shower with a problem and coming out, oh, I solved the problem, or falling asleep and having a dream, and it's like, ah, yes, I solved the problem, right?
I finished songs that way.
Exactly.
I need the hook at the end, I can't get it.
Exactly. But the difference is that that's not good enough. That's your starting point, shouldn't be your point of arrival. The rest of the work, which is much less glamorous, but it's necessary in science, and we should do it in every other, I think, realm of application, is the context of justification. That is, okay, I got this intuition, I think I'm right. Now, am I really right? Now it's the time to sit down and lay the thing in logical terms, see what kind of observations or experiments may be able to actually test my hypothesis reasonably, and so on and so forth. So you should never go from intuition to claim of knowledge. You should use your intuitions and rely on them as a guidance, because they may tell you that there is something wrong in a situation. Let's say in an emergency room, for instance, an experienced doctor may actually get it right more often than not. But there's no guarantee that that's the case. That's why having a colleague double-checking what you're doing, it's a good idea, especially if it's a life and death situation, right? Because yes, your intuitions can be right, but you can get cocky about it, and you can get too self-confident. And you're certainly not going to convince any other of your colleagues just on the basis of your intuitions if you're a scientist. Scientists would say, well, that's a great idea, now show me the data.
Great, so you've actually cleared that. Good, good. So I brought up the police or the TSA, that's only, and now don't rely only on your intuition.
Correct.
Massimo Pigliucci, thank you so much for being here. I greatly appreciate it, and I enjoyed our conversation. I'm glad you were able to come by.
It was a pleasure.
Oh, thank you. 502 Conversations, you can reach me at 502conversations@gmail.com if you so choose and you enjoyed this conversation. If you didn't enjoy it, your website is. But Plato footnote.wordpress.com, people can find you there.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much.
A pleasure.